Good afternoon, and welcome to the final panel of the 19th iteration of Brussels Forum. My name is Sarah Jones, and I could not be more honored to be standing here today as the Managing Director of GMF's leadership programs. In my role, I have an incredible opportunity to bring together leaders from all across Europe and all across the United States to engage in incredible conversations on many topics that were discussed here on this stage today and, of course, yesterday. We also get the opportunity to discuss many things that were maybe not uplifted on this main stage, but are still critically important to the transatlantic relationship. I'm going to be bringing together a panel of 3 of our alumni from all of these different fellowship programs that I get to run here at GMF. Before I introduce our panelists and bring them to the stage today, I want to briefly talk about our fellowships. With our Marshall Memorial Fellowship, we bring together leaders and travel them across the Atlantic and give them the opportunity to really understand and see firsthand what is happening in various countries, all across the states, and allow that to inform how they approach their personal, their community life, and also their professional, strategic decisions that they make after MMF. In our Policy Designers Network, we get the opportunity to create spaces for leaders all across our Eastern Partnership countries, the beautiful countries of Moldova, Georgia, Ukraine, and Armenia, to come together and really think about leadership and what the future of democracy can look like. And finally, we have our Transatlantic Inclusion Leaders Network. Our current cohort is sitting here in the audience today. These leaders get the opportunity to come together and talk about what inclusive leadership looks like in a time of isolationism, in a time where we're not sure what the future of democracy may look like, but we need inclusive leaders now more than ever. Please join me in welcoming to the stage 3 alumni from our various leadership programs to really discuss what the future and the next generation of transatlantic leadership can look like. Tara Hariharan is coming from Managing Director of NWI Management and MMF alum 2014. George Melashvili is coming from Georgia, and he is Policy Designers Network 2020. And we have Samira Rafaela, member of European Parliament.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you all so much for joining us today for our panel and really talking about the next generation of transatlantic leadership. There's been many things that have been discussed on this stage around what the future of democracy really looks like. Things like economic competitiveness, shifting geopolitical coalitions. But really what I want to take up the opportunity for us to do is think about how the next generation needs to approach this. What are the current threats that are maybe keeping you up at night as you think about the future of democracy? And maybe even more importantly, what are some potential solutions or ways to find solutions? Tara, I'd like to start with you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. It's an absolute honor to be here, and the energy and the vibrancy in this room just give me full faith that the transatlantic relationship is alive and thriving. That said, over the last 2 days here at the Brussels Forum, we have been discussing all the points of contention between the US and Europe. Many of them, of course, have to do with the political climate in the US. But I would like to focus and highlight 2 particular issues that are somewhat agnostic to US politics and to who might end up being in the White House in November, but that could continue to plague the transatlantic relationship. And I'm going to try to suggest a couple of constructive solutions as well. The first is the notion of industrial policy and the tension that we right now have between the US and Europe on their possibly diverging and competing industrial policies. Now, I know that the focus has been on whether Europe can keep up with the US's industrial policy on issues like semiconductors and electric vehicles. But I would posit that I think that Europe should take a completely different direction in terms of where it focuses its industrial policy strategy, and that should be solely and squarely on defense. I know that Europe is already working on an industrial defense strategy, and I think there is so much that could be obtained from working purely on the defense side of the industrial policy, just because it's an existential threat that we face here in Europe that needs to be that needs the security fulfillment. Secondly, the defense angle also has a feed through to the economic angle, and it can support domestic economies and populations. And also, bearing in mind US politics, the fact that the Europeans put more money into their defense could help maybe convince a certain presidential candidate in the US that the Europeans are finally pulling their weight on the defense and security side. So that's the first issue. The second issue I want to pick up is, again, a thread that we have been hearing a lot about today, and that is the differentials or the daylight between the US and Europe on strategies vis-a-vis China. Here, too, I'm not going to advocate that for any reason US and Europe have to harmonize their trade or investment controls against China. I would rather propose a more constructive solution where the US and Europe jointly band together to form a credible and viable and rules-based alternative to the Belt and Road Initiative that China has currently been demonstrating and been using as influence in the developing world. Now, I know that this is not a new idea. I know that the US has its PGII initiative, and I also know that the Europeans have their global gateway. But let's be fair, these have been piecemeal strategies so far, and they've really not come to the size and scope and influence that the BRI has. And I think it's absolutely vital that the US and Europe get together on this aspect vis-a-vis China, because ultimately Western supply chains, national security, and economic security are all going to be dependent on the US and Europe being able to access resources in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, basically the developing world.
Thank you, Tara. Absolutely. Samira, why don't you go ahead?
Yes, thank you very much, and it's an honor to have this invitation. It's very good to be back here with GMF, and specifically the TILM network. We have, to be honest, several disparities, and there is unrest. And I'm sorry to start my introduction like this, but we really need to be realistic here and really confronting the US and Europe and the rest of the world, our like-minded partners, with the reality here. And we can talk, and we should talk a lot about defense strategy, I totally agree. Economic security, also in terms of raw materials. Here also the role of trade agreements play a very important role. Next week in the European Parliament, we have very important votes on, for example, the forced labor ban regulation that I'm leading. This is a regulation that I am expecting to make the position of the US and Europe stronger together against the so-called system rivals, countries that definitely do not share our values. So this is an example where you see, for example, that trade legislation is being more harmonized on a transatlantic level. And that is very important given the geopolitical situation that we are in. The thing is that we should not only talk defense, trade, and security. We also are dealing with a situation where several governments, also in Europe, are approaching through policies that I'd say are absolutely not constructive. They doubt certain approaches that progressive governments, progressive politicians are trying to put in place. Whether it's about fighting climate, whether it's indeed about our defense policy. Take a look at the propaganda that is being spread among the Russian aggression against Ukraine, for example. What anti-rights movements are doing, both in the US and Europe. All these dynamics and powers are undermining the transatlantic power and specifically multilateralism. And that is very much at stake. When it comes to protecting the multilateral system, the US and Europe both are very important, also from a historical perspective, to protect that system. And this is what I see is being threatened. Specifically, we have the super elections 2024. What will happen? We already see it. Disinformation, a lot of misinformation. The role of technology, innovation, and AI plays a role here. Meaning that the US, the Europe, but also the rest of the world. Because let's also try to redefine Transatlanticism. Let's try to redefine that. We need more like-minded partners in the world. Africa, you've mentioned, the African continent. If you want to talk technology and innovation, we should be at the African continent because that's really the continent where it's all happening at the moment. When it comes to technology and innovation, take, for example, Kenya. I'm just amazed by what's happening in Kenya, for example. So, the thing is that we need to harmonize legislation as much as possible. We need to work together in the area of technology and innovation. The EU and the US already are working together in these so-called technology and trade council forms. So that's already happening. You see it also in the area of trade tools, where the US and the EU are working together. And given the super elections this year, they need to strategize with other like-minded parts and countries in the world to really counter these effects and dynamics. Because what's really at stake here is multilateralism, because of governments around the world that are taking another stance and that are guilty also of spreading a lot of disinformation and that are also pushing for certain movements, anti-rights movements, anti-democratic actors that are also using propaganda against individuals. Take, for example, xenophobia, racism, racist campaigns, for example, how citizens, individuals are being excluded in our society. And that populist talk, that populist way of doing politics that is infiltrated on very high levels in governments, that is exactly what is very dangerous for the existence of the multilateral system. And my last point is, if we lose the trust of people in our society, then we have even a bigger problem, meaning that they will be vulnerable for a lot of disinformation. So we have a role to play to keep educating, informing citizens about what is right, countering it as much as possible with facts, but also through dialogues, because constantly repeating the facts will not help. It means that we need to engage with people to make sure that they really understand and that they really feel heard.
Absolutely. I'm so glad that you brought in a lot of the systemic oppression, and that'll definitely get to my next question. But George, I want to give you the opportunity to also weigh in on what's maybe keeping you up at night as you think about the next generation and securing democracy.
Well, let's begin with a very simple notion. Europe and the United States, they need each other. Right now, we're in the middle of a very problematic period in the history. We're witnessing that one order, the order after the Cold War, is collapsing. And if we want to keep the system working, if we want to keep the international law as a system of governance of the world as it is right now, we definitely need Europe and the United States to work together. I'm from Georgia. It is a small country at the front line of Europe. We've seen the images, and this is actually a wonderful image on these huge monitors. This is a new generation which is trying to defend my country from what we have been talking about. The populists. The regime which is trying not to fulfill the will of the people of Georgia to join the European and transatlantic alliances, but trying to push us closer towards Kremlin. And that's probably the point that we all need to remember. Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, other countries, they're trying very hard to undermine the soul of the transatlantic alliance. They're trying to keep Europe and the United States away from each other, because this is the only way how they can actually win. And we, the people who live in Georgia, Ukraine, and Moldova, I arrived here from Moldova. So I've seen with my own eyes what Moldova is experiencing right now and what the Russian malign operations are doing in that country and in my country as well. Right now, on the screen, you are seeing the huge rally in Tbilisi. Probably the people are gathering in Tbilisi right now to defend the future of my country, but this is only the beginning. If we allow authoritarians to roam freely, if we do not defend liberty, if both Europe and the United States do not realize that we are actually at war, Ukrainians are defending their country with their blood. But at the same time, these same actors are trying to undermine our democracies, they're trying to undermine our ideals, and they're trying to undermine our belief in transatlantic leadership, in our ideals, in our future, and in our hopes. And when we're talking about the ways how to deal with it, I want to move to another picture as well. This is the grassroots attitude. The people in Tbilisi who are open their doors and houses, for those who can't read Georgian, the majority of you, it's written water, charger, phone, and Wi-Fi. So the people have opened their flats for those who are at Rustaveli Avenue, the main avenue in Tbilisi, defending the future of our country against the Russian laws that was imposed. And we're witnessing similar laws all across Europe. The populists trying to turn our tide, to make us close in each other, to isolate from each other. And this isolationism is probably the biggest challenge that we're witnessing right now.
Absolutely. Isolationism was discussed here yesterday in the morning, kind of talking about why this is happening and what we can do about it. But I think these powerful images really tell a story that showcase what exactly is happening and what we need to do, what our call to action is to support each other.
To stand closer to each other,
exactly.
To realize what we're facing, and to find solutions which will not be, simple trade treaties or simple industry complex policies. We need to understand what's going on, and we need to start acting accordingly. That's the only way for us to defend our ideals, to support and help the people of Ukraine, because right now, the whole alliance, the whole idea of transatlantic relationships is being tested in Ukraine. If Ukraine fails, so will the Western alliance in general.
I want to take us to the next question, which is around one of the words you just said, decisions. So before I get to that, I want to mention that I see us all as leaders, myself included. And as leaders, we have a platform. And with a platform comes a lot of power and a lot of privilege. Privilege in this sense meaning access to a lot of resources and, of course, access to more power. And as leaders with privilege and power, right, we have a common good that we should be fighting for, or work that we should be looking at. And as we make decisions, we have to think about those who maybe don't have as much power or privilege or access to even be in the room when decisions are made. What I'm trying to get at here is there are many vulnerable groups, many historically marginalized groups across both Europe and in the US that are not at the table when we make important policy decisions, but the impact of those decisions often have a really great toll on those groups, yet they don't have a voice at the table. So I'd like to ask you all, as we think about the future of democracy and the future of Atlanticism, how can we center the needs and the livelihoods of those who are not at the table and don't have power and privilege, but are very impacted on a day-to-day basis? Samira, can I start with you?
Yes, thank you. I mean, that is really one of the core questions that we need to ask ourselves, I believe, in society, because that's really about including people, inclusion, a fair society, but that's also how you fight populism. Because if people feel excluded, if they feel like they're not engaged, and that's, the main criticism that we as politicians receive, that a lot of people don't understand what we are doing and why we are doing that. And there is, in general, a lack of diversity in the public sector, but I'd say also in certain areas in the private sector, when it comes to intersectionality and diverse backgrounds. And I see, when I mention that also in my own environment, I see a lot of people like, oh, here we go again, diversity. Yes, I'm sorry, here we go again, diversity. Because if you want to prevent that we get distrust, unrest, disorder in society, then you need to work on diversity. That's the first step. I used to say in my former job also, look, I can get you diversity the next day. I'll get you 20 people that will apply for a job here. That's diversity. But then the second step is, how do you keep them?
Yeah.
That's inclusiveness. How do you keep them? How do you make sure that they fit into a system that has been built based on norms and people that they were not part of? In my work as a legislator, I often have said, yes, well, you can tell me that it goes like this, but I wasn't part of that. My generation, my great-great-grandparents were not part of that decision making. They were not part of that norm.
Right.
Meaning society has been changed, meaning that we need to redefine the norm again, break it open, and do it actually all over again. This is also what needs to happen within our multilateral organizations to see how these organizations are being built. When it specifically comes to the engagement of young people in politics, it is very important that we elevate them, that we show and broadcast the good examples, that we invest in role models for them to feel inspired. And also as politicians and legislators and policymakers, we need to invite them to make them sit at the table, like literally. This is what I've been doing 1 hour before this panel, to speak to female and young candidates of color mainly that are going to run, because I feel like I really want to transfer my knowledge, making sure that a new generation that will enter politics has the knowledge to be effective politicians. So that's the personal responsibility that we as politicians and legislators have. And when you do sit at the table, when you have that seat, you really need to make sure that you use the powers. Stay your authentic self. That's what I always tell to the next generation, especially people from marginalized communities. Because when you have that power, you can really change something. I have shown that with my team, and for example, with the Pay Transparency Directive, where we, for the first time ever in EU legislation, have intersectional discrimination recognized. And that is the power that people can have from marginalized communities, communities that we don't see at the table often. So when they sit there, they really need to take that legislative power. But we really need to make sure that they sit at the table first. And this is a true investment that we are all responsible for. And you know, my last point, for the people who are always allergic to the topic of diversity, if you don't like the soft side of it, then let's talk the hard side of it. Economics, numbers, statistics. I mean, it shows that our economy will be better. Our society will be better. Families become better from it. If you yourself want to become more rich and you want to have more welfare, then invest in diversity. Because it will end up with you also on the individual level, becoming a better person.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Samira. And one point I want to make before I turn over to... Yes. Thank you. One point I want to make is one of the words you brought up was authentic. And I think it's very important that we also hammer home what it means to show up authentically. Before I pass it over to Tara to hear your response, I want to name that I am wearing a suit that is Black-owned, and I wore it on purpose to be on this stage and have this platform, to be able to showcase not only who I am and the work that I do, but also the people I come from and the circulation of what it means to put money back into historically marginalized groups like the Black population. So I appreciate you naming authenticity. And I think it's very important that we all show up authentically, which is what we try and tell our fellows on a day-to-day basis.
I saw you this morning and I was like, where did you get that?
I'll tell you later.
Yes.
Tara, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Thank you both for very valuable comments on a very personal level. I want to now take this to the 1,000-foot level and basically talk about the unintended consequences of Western economic statecraft on the economic livelihoods of disadvantaged people, not just on both sides of the Atlantic, but also globally. We have to remember that measures like tariffs, sanctions, industrial policy, these all do have consequences, very much in terms of inflationary consequences. And in the US, it's even become an issue of electoral consequence at this point, where marginalized populations are really feeling the pain of higher oil prices and food prices. And indeed, this could become an election issue come November. But it's not just on both sides of the Atlantic that inflation is feeling its bite. The entire developing world is hurting, again, thanks to high oil and food prices. And basically, it's not just the geopolitical shocks, it's also the impact of the response, the Western response, as justified and as meaningful as it may be. It's exacerbating these shocks, and it's marginalizing these populations further. So I would just remind all of the policymakers and change makers in this room that we have to keep in mind these marginalized populations while crafting policy, and that's why economic statecraft has to be as surgically implemented as possible. It has to be a scalpel instead of a sledgehammer at any point in time. And I want to bring up also something that you iterated many times, Samira, and that I completely agree with you, the importance of the multilateral institutions. I mentioned the developing world and the pain that vulnerable groups are going through there thanks to these inflation issues. There's also a serious problem of high debt levels and the inability to gain debt relief because the West and China are basically, frankly, dickering over the issue. And so I personally think one of the best things that the US and Europe could do at this stage is to really reinvigorate the original Bretton Woods multilateral institutions, the IMF and the World Bank, and go at it from a perspective where we're not just waiting for China to come to the table to grant debt relief to these hurting emerging markets nations, that we provide the debt relief ourselves. And it's going to be important for all of us in the long term to support these marginalized communities, not just at home, but abroad.
Thank you. I really appreciate your ability to go to that 30,000 feet look, but then also say great analogies that really hammer home your point. I want to take us to the last question that I have for us, which is going to be more of a rapid fire. But we have many budding leaders in the space today, and we have many established leaders in the space today. I'd like to ask you all if you have a one-liner, some sort of advice, either to the budding leaders or the leaders who are already established here in this room, around what it means to create a prosperous future, a prosperous democracy for the next generation of transatlantic leaders. George?
Well, first of all, it will be never give up. Because if there is anything that can tell us from the history, even of my family, that was expelled from our hometown, the city of Sukhumi, that was occupied by the Russian forces and remains occupied up until now, it is that you should never, ever give up, and you should always follow your ideals to build the society that you yourself want to live, and also think about the future generations. Because otherwise, it's not the way to go. You need to realize what you want to change, you need to identify it, and then you need to find courage to stand against any odds. So never give up. That will be my advice.
Thank you, George. Samira?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the next generation leaders, they can do a lot, especially now in the whole developments with technology, with AI. This is really where the next generation can use it as an opportunity. There are a lot of opportunities there, but we should also regulate. We should also mainstream human rights. We should also take a look after human rights and ethics, because the society is becoming more and more complex through this innovative, new technology society, and this is where the next generation grew up with. I mean, they speak that language. It's their whole way of doing, and at the same time, they can play a very important role to make sure that society stays inclusive. Also, given these technologies, and especially when you look at marginalized communities, the biases that we find in technology. So this is a very important area where I hope that the next generation will dive in. The second area, also adding to what you said about debt relief, we need a global financial reforming. That's really what needs to happen. So I hope that the next generation is also going to enter a lot in the area of economics, indeed the multilateral organizations, where the reform of the global financial system needs to be rebuilt, because this is exactly where you can gain the opportunities to work for marginalized communities and to deliver for marginalized communities. Then on a personal note, towards the youth and the next generation, help each other out. I mean, do not compete with each other, really. Like, you're in the same boat. Many of us want the same for the future. So help each other out, work together, build alliances. Like the new politics, the new multilateralism is like really cooperation on the next level. Mm-hmm. And make sure that all your alliances and your coalitions that you are in it yourself are diverse. Make sure that you take care of that. And I see the next generation like thriving and ruling the world. I mean, I am not that old, but there's already a generation after me, like the Gen Z. Even I work with them. They sit here too. That I see like, oh my God, they're so bold. So they are going to do it, I believe. Yeah.
Well, if we're talking about the Gen Z, it is exactly the Gen Z which is defending my country's future right now. Mm. And they were the force behind the first repulsion of the Russian law in my country. So Gen Z is also a very powerful force that needs to be considered.
Yeah. No pressure.
Oh, there is a lot of pressure. You need to make the world a better place.
Tara, if you don't mind taking us home.
Thank you. So as an absolute nerd on international relations, I'm going to use one of my favorite buzzwords, which is variable geometry. Mm. Now, variable geometry, I'll very loosely define it here. It's the idea that you can form flexible and fluid alliances and agreements, that you don't need to have everybody in the room agreeing on everything at the same time. You don't need to have complete consensus. You don't have to have unanimity to get things done. And I think this is so important, especially in Europe, where we have this multiplicity of member states and what is called the strategic cacophony of voices. You cannot have everybody agree on everything at the same time. And also in terms of how the West deals with the rest of the world. You've heard me really hammering home the point about getting the developed world and the developing world in the room at the same time and at the table at the same time. We have to remember that the developing world may not have the same incentives, the same values even that we have here in the West. And so I think variable geometry is the way to go, both in personal leadership styles as well as at the 1,000-foot level. And in this multipolar world that we work in, we need to get things done practically.
Fantastic. Panelists, I would like to ask that you remain seated. And Heather, I'd like to turn it over to you for some closing remarks.
Well, speaking about bringing it home, thank you. You are builders of the future. You are builders of the transatlantic relationship, and I have never been more hopeful. So thank you so very much. I hope everyone felt like they walked through a little bit of history the last 2 days. We were certainly watching it a little bit. I hope you all felt that you stood at the intersection of security, democracy, and prosperity. It's a tough intersection. But we know the transatlantic relationship is there and has to be successful. We here at GMF could not be successful without extraordinary partners. Our founding partners, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Belgium, our great forum partners, NATO, Boeing, the Agora Institute, and all of our associate and supporting partners. We could not thank you enough. You make our work possible. And Brussels Forum would not be possible without an extraordinary GMF team led by Louise Langeby. Louise, where are you? She's somewhere. Paige Ennis. We had, here, come on down. We had 35 volunteers who just came to say, I want to be part of this. Every part of the GMF team was part of it. So thank you all so much. And in the business, we say, that's a wrap. And then as your bonus, the networking reception is out there. Thank you so much. If you thought the 19th edition is exciting, you wait for the 20th edition. We look forward to welcoming you back to Brussels Forum. Thank you and good night.